we have a new regulatory framework in the Digital Services Act, which has the tools to be able to tackle these types of what's referred to as systemic risks. But we haven't quite, I think, got to the point where we are regularly and deliberately applying that framework to these particular risks. We're getting there, but we're not quite there. So that's that issue. And as we are developing the skills and the tools and the ability to apply this regulatory framework, and it's not the only regulatory framework, but I think it's central here, we are overtaken by a whole entire new nuance to this entire problem in the form of artificially generated content. And the volume and the scale and the sheer sort of potential for the creation of misleading, inaccurate content is just multiplied while we're still working through the last problem.
Welcome to the DIACOMET podcast. Today we are happy to speak to Maria Donde, the International Affairs Director at the Media and Online Safety Regulator in Ireland. In the past, she has also worked for Ofcom, served as a member of the board of the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, has been an expert member of Council of Europe working groups, and has also worked in advertising regulation and as a radio producer for the BBC World Service. Dear Maria, thank you for joining us on the DIACOMET podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
For the past years, you've worked across broadcasting, advertising regulation, media, and digital policy. Can you explain what are some of the biggest changes you have observed in these areas during your time of work?
Yes, absolutely. So I should explain, I started working in the broader field of media regulation over 20 years ago. So I began my regulatory career working for the advertising self-regulatory body in the UK. And thinking about this question and thinking sort of back through my 20 years in this field, I was reflecting on the fact that when I started working at the Advertising Standards Authority, we were receiving complaints from the public by letter, handwritten and through the post. And in fact, that was the majority of the complaints that we received. Some rare individuals would come to us by email. So the last 20 years has seen a huge seismic, indescribably large change in the media environment in general and in the way that people communicate more broadly. I have seen us move from 2G to 5G, which of course has had a massive impact on the way that people consume audiovisual content on their phones and outside of the home. We have seen the shift in viewing of audiovisual content more generally so dramatic that it's almost kind of impossible to imagine, with the impact of the streamers initially and then video sharing platforms online and the move away from traditional broadcast viewing really has happened over the last 20 years. That has, of course, also impacted significantly on the funding and the business models for producing content, for producing quality content. It's also impacted quite significantly on the public service media framework that we have in Europe and that we have relied on for such a long time. We've also seen, I think, real changes we have evidence for this, in the way that people trust sources of information and sources of news and current affairs. We've seen, of course, huge polarization in people's view of the world, which in turn we suspect has an impact on our democratic institutions as well. But again, these are all areas of ongoing research, and actually 20 years probably isn't enough to be able to identify exactly what those impacts are. And then I suppose the final thing that I would mention is, so I worked for quite a long time at Ofcom, which is the UK's communications regulator. And I can pinpoint a specific time in around 2017, 2018, when there was a full 180-degree reversal in our views on online regulation. I recall that moment really well. Up until that point, Ofcom, as a regulator, was publicly arguing against any form of internet regulation. We believed that self-regulation and a combination of public awareness, media literacy was the right solution to maintaining a vibrant, pluralistic media environment. And that changed really quite dramatically almost overnight. And that was primarily driven, I think, by concerns about child online safety. So I do think it is interesting to reflect on the fact that only, less than 10 years ago, we were still of the view that there was a self-regulatory approach that would work for the online environment. And we couldn't be further from that now. The other thing that I think and I would say this is a more recent development and something that's really worrying for all of us, and particularly in the EU, where I'm working now in Ireland, is the influence of the US political environment on our own work. I think this kind of very loud dogma coming out of the US establishment about the fact that our regulatory frameworks are against human rights and against the right of freedom of expression and restricting freedom of expression is a really big change in the way that we are working. I don't think we necessarily have quite understood how to respond to that, how to mitigate or how to deal with that kind of pressure coming from what you might have imagined as one of our biggest allies and partners in relation to trying to seek the kind of outcomes that we want for the information environment. And we can talk a bit bit more about that later, but it is in the same way that the US shift in geopolitical terms has taken Europe by surprise. I think it's also true to say that that's the case in our online regulatory field as well.
Would you say this is one of the major issues today, this lack of collaboration maybe, or different ideas how this environment should open, what it means to be free, to be inclusive?
Yeah, I would. I honestly think it's quite existential, and we're only just starting to realize that. It's certainly something that in my role, and my role is related to collaboration, international collaboration and cooperation, it's very much a priority topic. Yes, I would say it's very much so.
And how would you maybe say you're dealing with this? Do you think it's going well or not so well?
It's an interesting question. I think we are still in the process of developing our strategies in this area, I would say. And as someone whose job it is in part responsible for developing those strategies, I can put my hand up and say that I think there's still a lot to reflect on and to think about. I think, not speaking necessarily for my own organization, although I think we do have a willingness to engage with these questions, I think it's really important for us in Europe as public bodies and as public authorities responsible for good outcomes for the public in relation to media. I do think it's important for us to be standing up and saying these are the aspects that we think are important for both for protecting the public and for ensuring that everyone has access to reliable information and high quality content that reflects their lives and their communities. That's our job. And I think we should be able to stand behind the way that we do that and to make the case for the fact that this is far from restricting freedom of expression, in fact, promotes it. We struggle a little bit as a regulatory community to tell our story, to talk about why what we do is important and how the public can also be involved in that, and how our role is to support the public and to support public interest outcomes. And you can see I'm struggling to articulate it myself. I think, I'm not a communications expert, but I do think we need to be much more active in that regard. I think it's important for us to be able to tell a story about the role of regulation and the importance that it plays in ensuring that the public interest is maintained and that there is a balance of power. And I think it's something we need to be able to talk about more eloquently.
So you've mentioned public interest, the role of regulation in public interest. What do you recognize as some other main issues in achieving this? So what is limiting or minimizing the public interest in the digital environment? What do you see as the main threats?
I mean, there are a lot. Let's start with the question of information. Conclusions that we're reaching and the views that we hold are based on, and as they should be, on evidence. And that evidence largely comes, I think, from research, academia, and the invaluable work that's done actually by civil society and academia working in these fields. And there are multiple issues here, and they are only just now being exacerbated by the far more widespread use and application of AI generated content. So we have a situation in which falling trust in previously trusted institutions combines with a proliferation of, just huge quantities of information, a massive shift in people's consumption of news to the online space. So all the reports that we see are that people understand themselves to be obtaining their news content from the online space, and to a very large extent through social media, as we understand social media. So all of that information, all of that reliance on the online space for getting information about the world is curated and structured by algorithms which are developed by online platforms for a number of different purposes, including very positive purposes in some cases, to try to provide people with content that's genuinely interesting and relevant to them. That in and of itself is not an evil intention. But of course, we also know that another driver of the algorithmic curation that we see is about engagement, is about keeping people on the platforms, is about serving advertisers with eyeballs, as it were. And so that in itself, by definition, is not in the public interest. Mm-hmm. It is in somebody else's interest. It is in another interest. Those interests are legitimate, but in this case, they are potentially conflicting with the public interest. And we are in this situation, and we have a new regulatory framework in the Digital Services Act, which has the tools to be able to tackle these types of what's referred to as systemic risks. But we haven't quite, I think, got to the point where we are regularly and deliberately applying that framework to these particular risks. We're getting there, but we're not quite there. So that's that issue. And as we are developing the skills and the tools and the ability to apply this regulatory framework, and it's not the only regulatory framework, but I think it's central here, we are overtaken by a whole entire new nuance to this entire problem in the form of artificially generated content. And the volume and the scale and the sheer sort of potential for the creation of misleading, inaccurate content is just multiplied while we're still working through the last problem. think that is probably how I would characterize the situation as it is now. It's kind of depressing to think about it that way, because it does feel a little bit like what I'm describing is an attempt to mitigate risk, which is overwhelmed by what's happening in the world, never mind the kind of geopolitical context that we were discussing earlier. So it is quite easy to, I think, despair at this point. We can talk about strategies and we can talk about what can be done and what is being done. So I'm not completely pessimistic about it, but I do think, and I hear a lot of commentators say this, and so this is not an original thought of mine, but I think we need to recognize the moment as one of opportunity rather than one of still waiting to see what happens. Because regulators are really fundamentally driven, and rightly so, by wanting to have a very strong evidence base before they take any kind of intervention actions, we find ourselves in quite a difficult position because the evidence, of course, is still very new and very early, and we're not quite there yet in that regard. So it's tricky to be able to make significant advances, but we have to somehow find an accommodation with that, because as I say, I take very seriously the warnings from academics, from commentators, from civil society, which say that if action is not taken quite quickly, then we are in danger of missing this moment, missing this opportunity, and finding ourselves in an even worse situation that we were in, before the DSA was introduced.
So a lot is at stake, you would say?
I would say so. And we really need to take that very seriously. The thing, we haven't talked, for example, about the threats and the harms posed to children by the online platforms in which they are largely, living effectively. That is something, I think, which is starting to really, the evidence base here is really starting to become quite solid. And, you've seen some of the court cases, for example, out of the US just this week, which have found evidence of direct harm to individuals, to people, to children from the way that online platforms are designed. Those, I think, are quite fundamental and really, really solidify a case for much stronger intervention. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be banning children from social media platforms altogether, but I think we need to have very detailed and honest conversations about what actually is the best way to protect children online. But the case for doing so is now incontrovertible, I think.
Of course, there is a lot of harms for children, but also for other generations. Do you see any parts of society as more vulnerable to these threats, or would you say these vulnerabilities are just different and expressing themselves in different ways?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think I definitely would agree that every one of us is vulnerable, actually. Mm-hmm. And of course, we need to recognize vulnerable groups, and we need to ensure that their needs and their rights are respected. I do think it's important for us, for none of us to be complacent, and none of us to think about ourselves as somehow, immune to any impacts of the information space in which we are all also existing. It's a really, really important point. And I also think recognizing that and thinking about it from that perspective also allows us to be able to articulate the fact that we are all also responsible. We have our own responsibilities in shaping the environment in which we exist. Educating ourselves and educating adults is just as important as educating children and educating older people in the digital space. That I feel very, very strongly about that. And it's something that, my organization takes very, very seriously. The Irish Media Commission Naman, where I work, has a really extensive media literacy policy and education program. It's something we put a huge amount of resource into, and it's something where Ireland has been Europe leading, world leading for many years, and working at the kind of grassroots level with communities through our media literacy network is the way that we articulate those policy objectives in the real world. I think it's incredibly important. And so thinking about it from the perspective of, everybody is impacted by this digital world is the important starting point for that perspective. Yeah.
Would you pinpoint any other recent developments or achievements that you think are a good response to the challenges?
So I would probably talk about the European Democracy Shield, which I think is very important. This is an initiative that's come out from the European Commission, jointly really developed through the DG Justice and DG Connect. So it's an attempt, I think, to articulate the different elements, both of regulation and non-regulatory tools and approaches, which can help to ensure a healthier information environment. I mean, ultimately, it is an approach, I think, to articulate through the European regulatory and policy frameworks what information integrity policy looks like. And that's a really positive development from the EU. It's a package of measures, and it includes references to existing legislation, but it also includes the creation of a European Democracy Resilience Centre, which allows for cooperation and collaboration in relation to threats to democracy. It's a little vague, but it's just been set up. Let's see what it can do. But it also includes a package of funding for local news, for media literacy initiatives. It talks about the importance of the Media Freedom Act in ensuring media pluralism and media freedom, and the importance of strong public service media in ensuring the health of the media environment. It talks about the parts of the DSA which are relevant to this discussion, which we've just talked about as well. It kind of brings together this holistic picture of the different tools that can be used all together and at the same time to ensure that we are moving towards an information space that supports democracy. So I think there's a lot of positive aspects to it. Some people would have preferred it to be harder law and introduce, more obligations and more statutory requirements for platforms, for other entities in this space, for media organizations, for member states even. But I think it's a good starting point in any case. The Media Freedom Act, of course, is also very, very important in this regard, and it has a number of really important provisions in it, which again are really critical to the type of things, the type of outcomes that we're talking about, importance of properly funding and ensuring the independence of public service media, for example, and many other factors, including, for example, provisions around media concentration as well, and measuring media pluralism within Europe. So all of these are all really important instruments. I think sometimes we forget about the DMA and the importance that the Digital Markets Act can, and I think is likely to have in relation to the health and the sustainability of the media ecosystem. There are provisions in there which talk about the importance of media organizations having access to data and being able to compete fairly with other players in the advertising market and so on, which I think is also really, maybe gets overlooked a little bit sometimes, but is also really key. And then, of course, it's not just about Europe. There's also the Online Safety Act in the UK, which is an important instrument, and indeed the Digital Competition and Markets, forgetting the name exactly, Act in the UK, which also mirrors some of the DMA requirements as well. So there's a broad picture across Europe and a number of different instruments which are also looking at this. The only other thing I would mention is, in the context of protecting children, is the value and importance of an instrument called the Guidelines for Article 28 under the DSA. So this is a DSA-related initiative, and it is only guidelines, but I would really urge everyone who all of your listeners to take a look at those guidelines, because they have a lot of detail in there about what good platform design looks like. And you can apply that, of course, to protecting children, but you also can look at that set of guidelines as a little bit of a wish list for what good design for platforms is for all citizens. As we were saying, it's not just children who are vulnerable.
You've mentioned the difference in the speed of the changes and in the speed of the regulatory adjustments. How do you feel that you're tackling this big problem, I would say? Do you think you're successful, or what needs to be done?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, we talked about some of the challenges facing regulators already, right? The fact that we are necessarily and correctly sometimes slow, because we need to build evidence, we need to build strong cases, we need to build cases that are going to withstand challenges in court, which are, already happening and inevitable and going to be the reality of our working lives for the foreseeable future. So it does take us time. I think there are a couple of things which we are starting to do better. I prefer to think about, I suppose, that way. It's difficult for me to call out, all of the things I think we're doing wrong. But let's say we are starting to collaborate much better, both across borders and across different sectors. One of the things that has been really important, I think, over the last 5 or 6 years has been this emergence of networks and groups of regulators who work across the digital space. So data protection regulators, competition regulators, consumer protection regulators, even financial authorities sometimes, and of course online safety and media regulators. And those regulators getting together at the national and at the European level and working together and slowly developing common strategies, and understanding that some tools are better than others in certain circumstances, collaborating on that level, I think, and collaborating also to understand the harms, to gain technical knowledge in an efficient way so that everybody is learning at the same time and has access to the right kind of technical expertise. These things, I think, are starting and are going to be the future. Like, I genuinely believe that that's the best way to approach trying to find good outcomes here, and actually becoming a little bit more nimble and maybe a bit faster at reacting to some of the, everyday crises that we're constantly seeing. The GROC notification function is a really good example of that, because when that happened, that was the first time I really saw, Irish regulators very quickly getting together, talking about who was looking at it from which perspective. Does it trigger this legislation? Does it trigger these obligations? Trying to understand where exactly these types of services fit within the regulatory landscape. Is it a data protection issue? Is it an online harms issue? And very quickly kind of responding and reacting to that. And the European Commission, of course, also needs to participate in those discussions. And so that needs to happen at the EU level. But there, I think we're getting better at that. So I feel quite optimistic about that. I think we, perhaps taking it from the other perspective, I think where we could do better, and this is probably a bit more of a personal view of mine and thinking about not necessarily my organization, but kind of the regulatory space more generally. I think we can be a bit more courageous and forthright about our role in helping to identify what kind of content and what kind of approaches to producing content, and particularly news content, are in the public interest. So I'm really, really interested in this idea of, regulators working together to identify the criteria and the characteristics of public interest content beyond the PSM and the public service media frameworks that we have in place. And I think it's really important for us to be able to reach judgments, to apply our regulatory responsibilities and our rules, which have been set out by our elected governments, and to apply those rules in a way that helps to demonstrate the fact that not all content is equal, that some people are not acting in the public interest when they create editorial content, and helping people to understand the difference. I think that's that's a really important thing for regulators to be doing. And I personally don't think that we are doing that enough.
So in a sense, proactiveness.
There's one other thing I would add as well is I think some of us are better at this than others. I think it's really important for us to take up the model that's actually developed by the DSA, which is of multi-stakeholder cooperation in these areas, right? Like I feel genuinely with my hand on my heart can say that my organization is committed to this, but sort of working at the grassroots level, understanding what's happening in communities, what kind of initiatives are working or helping to develop people's skills, to develop people's resilience, to develop people's ability to protect themselves, and then translating that into policy. Yes, in part, that's also government's job, and we should be working with government on that as well. But we are in a good place to do that kind of convening and learning from the grassroots level, and then picking that up and pushing it through into actual regulatory policy. And then generally also being able to draw on the expertise and the work of civil society, of academia, and partner with those types of organizations to make sure that we are making use of and bringing all of that kind of work and expertise and evidence into our work and into our judgments. I think we have to be very, more and more open all the time and more structured and deliberative in that regard as well.
Which is in line with all the developments which are more global, more different entities involved.
Exactly.
Okay, maybe to finish on a very positive note, I would like to know or ask you, how do you see a good digital environment, a healthy one, a democratic? What do you think are the main characteristics it should have?
There are so many, really good, strong models to choose from to look at this. In answering this question, I would always draw on, for example, the Media Pluralism Monitor and the risks indicators framework. So it's to turn it upside down and say where those risks are low, that is a healthy media environment. One in which you have strong and well received and well used local news media. One in which you have a strong PSN, which is trusted and understood and used and part of everybody's lives and independent and well funded. One in which you have, a good, healthy, competitive environment between media outlets and between media ownership. One in which people are given proper opportunities to learn and to understand the media environment. So really proper national media literacy strategies, which sit across all parts of government, basically, so that opportunities to ensure people are media literate are used in every possible instance and not just through formal education. And I think none of those will be a surprise to you and to your listeners, and I'm sure everyone, it's not particularly controversial to say any of these things. What I do also think, though, is that we need to be a little bit better at understanding what actually works and focus. I talked a little bit about that kind of grassroots element. I think we should be taking more time to identify the types of policies and strategies which are having actual beneficial outcomes and amplifying those. Because at the moment, I feel like all of these discussions tend to be quite theoretical, which is, understandable. But I do feel like we're kind of talking to ourselves, even with that kind of openness that I talked about. Regulators, academics, and even civil society, maybe less so civil society, but generally speaking, we're all agreed on what a healthy media environment and information integrity looks like. But I'm not really sure we are very good at demonstrating which of these theoretical principles or concepts are actually having an impact in the real world. And that, I think, is where the partnership between policymakers and researchers is really important. And that's hopefully something that we are seeing more and more of and that we can learn from.
Okay, thank you so much.